Mark. All yours, Mark.
Thank you, Andy, and welcome, Chris. And yeah, there's heightened anticipation for your session tonight. A lot of, as Andy said earlier, an awful lot of people have signed in. So yeah, without further ado, let you crack on, sir.
All right, no pressure there then. I'm going to start off by getting two jokes out of the way because these come up quite a lot. I'm going to try not to drone on, and yes, my business has really taken off since I started. So just going to get those two jokes out of the way, and then we can forget they ever existed. So to start off with, I'm just going to introduce myself, and essentially my name's Chris Bradbury. Some of you might know me from my involvement with the ASRC, but primarily I run Altitude Aerial Photography Ltd, and we are a drone specialist company that does surveying, filming, photography, with our primary work coming from the television sector. We hold an operational safety case, which allows us to fly up to 25 kilo drones. But more importantly, we can fly those 5 meters from the public up to a maximum altitude of 600 feet. And we can also fly 30 meters from open air assemblies. So essentially, our permit is far more advanced than 99.9% of drone operators out there. I get to fly with some really, really cool toys, as you can see here. This is one of our M600 drones. They're just over 1100 millimeter span, 21-inch propellers, weighs 15 and a bit kilos and can carry a 6 kilo payload. So we've got very advanced choices of camera options underneath. And we've got to work with some fantastic companies over the years, from Fast and Furious live performance shows and Alton Towers and big companies like that, through to most of the main TV production companies. You might have seen one of the more recent jobs that we did was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, where you might have seen me crashing the prototype during development, but we did the filming where Dave Fisher was flying the final aircraft towards the end there, which you can see in the images. And tonight, all I'm going to do very quickly is go through drone regulations. And when I say quickly, we haven't got time to go through drone regulations. It would be an entire presentation on its own. So I'm just going to give you a very quick bullet point. There are some presentations already done by the BMFA on Article 16, which you could always go and look up on the YouTube channel. So there's no point dwelling on that too much. Then I'm going to talk you through how I plan a shoot. And then I'm sure a lot of you want to know what is the best drone. So I've got that in there as a quick topic. Probably what's the best settings to use for your camera and how to get the best out of a shot. And then how to use your camera a bit more creatively. And then towards the end, a little bit on image editing. So how you to make the best of those photographs once you've got them. So drone regulations, the first things first, if you're a BMFA member, hopefully you're going to be going out and flying under Article 16. Article 16 you can download from the BMFA website for the RCC, and you can see everything about Article 16 and the regulations. If you discover that the flight you want to do doesn't quite fit in Article 16, then chances are you're going to be looking at CAP 722. Now, the important thing here is if you're flying under Article 16, the entire flight from start to finish needs to be under Article 16. And likewise, if you're going under CAP 722, you can't pick and match the flight criteria. If you are flying in CAP 722, then you'll probably end up in one of the A categories for the open series. You've got A1, A2, and A3. And what I've done here is a very quick summary of the three categories. There is a lot more to it. If you want to look at it in detail, Civil Aviation Authority publication CAP 2012 has a nice little chart of what the categories are and what the specifications for each category are. But in a nutshell, the A1 is essentially anything under 250 grams. So think Mavic Minis, for example. The A2 at the moment would be 2 kilos. It will go to 4 kilos once the new aircraft categories, C category drones appear, but at the moment there aren't any. So you'd be 2 kilos, but a lot of people then associate this with the A2 CFC, which is the Certificate of Competence. And I would class that as the entry level for work. So things like estate agency, photography, doing some weddings, that kind of thing. And the A3 category is anything up to 25 kilos, 150 meters from congested areas. So basically it's the older hobby regs before we joined EASA would be a good way of summarizing that category. If you're looking at going beyond any of those categories, then your chances are you'll end up in the specific category, which is where my company operates, Altitude. And this is where you'd need an operational authorization from the CAA to do what you do. There used to be the PFAW, the Permit for Aerial Work, which became the Permit for Commercial Operation, which is now the OA, or the Operational Authorization. And then my operational safety case is another variation of an operational authorization. The last one is certified category. If any of you are doing aerial photography in that category, I really want to see that aircraft, because that would class as anything that links to the same risk as manned aviation. So this is things like flying taxis, for example. That's where you get into the certified category. So that would be one heck of a camera ship. I'd love to see that. The next question is, can I fly for money? Very common question. If you'd asked me before Christmas, absolutely not. You needed a permit for commercial operation because it was all about doing commercial activity, i.e. being paid. Under the new regulations from the 1st of January onwards, the commercial element has disappeared and it's all risk-based. So if you're flying following Article 16 or CAP 722, then yes, you can be paid for the flight. The one caveat for that is if you're under Article 16, you do need insurance that complies with EC 785/2004, which BMFA insurance doesn't cover. So if you're going to fly for money, just bear in mind that your BMFA membership insurance will not cover you. You'll need to get a separate insurance policy. Where can I fly? Obviously, we've got an airplane in the background there. That was a job we did for TV flying around the Cotswolds Airport. That was Britain's next air disaster. Drones. So that's not really a great topic to discuss on tonight, but there we go. So if you're going to fly near an airport, just remember that you have got flight restriction zones, you've got air traffic control to speak to. So it's not that you can't fly near an airport, but you do need to make sure you do the right due diligence by contacting the ATC and making sure they know you're there. Basically, we don't want Gatwick 2. Built up areas, so town centres, anywhere that's classed as congested. So this could be anywhere that's kind of set up for leisure, housing, industrial infrastructure, road, rail, and so on. In a conversation I've had with CAA in the past, something like a beach or a park where you've got plenty of space around you will be classed as a leisure area once it's filled up with enough people that the people can't escape. So if you want to take a scenario of flying on somewhere like a beach, the moment that beach gets quite crowded, you need to think twice about flying there because those people aren't going to be able to escape. You might want to fly and photograph a local landmark or something while you're on holiday. The area might be open to the public, so these are all things you might want to think about. You've then got open countryside, middle of nowhere, so that's obviously a nice, easy place to fly. And then you might have private residences. So this comes back to maybe flying for wedding photography, for example, going to a hotel and doing some of that kind of stuff. The key thing to bear in mind for any of these locations, doesn't matter where you fly, anywhere has potential to be restricted airspace. So don't just assume because you're in the middle of nowhere, like the bottom image there, that it's just a country field with nothing around, that it's perfectly safe to fly. Anywhere could have local restrictions or bylaws that prevent you taking off and flying legally. So just make sure that you know what the situations are for that. And also anywhere you fly, you have to maintain the minimum separation distance as required, either in Article 16 or in the open categories of CAP 722. So when you look at these 4 pictures here, you've got a town centre, you've got a landmark, a private building, and then the open countryside. It's actually that bottom image there, the open countryside, that was the hardest one for us, because that's National Trust property. National Trust have a 0 tolerance on drones, they don't permit them. And also it's a military low fly zone, so we would have had Eurofighters coming through there at 200 feet. So you could look at the top image and think, right, built up area, you know what the risks are there, empty field, perfectly safe. That's not necessarily the case. So you always need to think restricted airspace, local restrictions, and maintaining separation. So this leads me on to planning a flight. So the image you're looking at there is from Google Maps in 3D, and it's a picture of the Royal Albert Palace down in Brighton. And Royal Albert Palace, something like that Anyway, we were asked to do a job there for Dancing on Ice and ITV, and the white rectangle there is they wanted to set up a temporary ice rink, which we were going to do some filming of, and which essentially turned into doing these shots. So the way I approach planning a shoot is exactly the same, whether I'm just popping down to take a single photo with the Mavic or I'm going down to do a large shoot. The first thing I'll do is I'll go to Google Maps. And the reason for that is I want to know what's in the area, what's near me, and what I might need to consider. When you go to Google Maps, if you right click on it with a mouse and go to the bottom of the drop down list, you'll see that it says you can measure something. So from that, I can do things like this, where I can create a 150-meter radius and I can associate what's in the area I'm going to be flying as to what I need to control. So straight away here, we can look at where it's the center of the circle is where the ice rink would have been. Within that 150 meters, I've got the A23, I've got a park, I've got entrances to various different buildings and estates and so on. So it gives me a good idea of what I've got to start with by going to Google Maps. From Google Maps, I'll go to Drone Assist. Drone Assist is an app you can download for most smartphones and devices. It allows you to zoom in and out by pinching, which is really, really useful. The best part with this is it shows you flight restrictions based on drone activity primarily. So straight away they're looking at Brighton, so it's the same area. You can see to the left we have the red circle with the three red lines. That's Shoreham Airport, and the lines are also showing me the runway rotations. So I know essentially if I'm going to be on a flight path or if I'm going to be off a flight path, and they're sort of things to consider. The next yellow circle, which is directly next to that, is the Devil's Dyke hang gliders. So again, I know that I've got to look for something that's an airborne risk there. And just above that, the slightly smaller yellow circle is Auburn Airport. Now, the nice thing with that is it demonstrates that not every airport has a flight restriction zone. Most of them do, but not all of them. So if I was flying in Auburn's airspace, even though it's not red, common sense says to me to go and speak to them and make sure that they know what I'm doing and that I'm not going to interfere with anything they're doing. The smallest yellow circle down to the right by Farmer Road there, that's actually the Hidden Valley Flying Park, which is a model club for people who do FPV flying, I believe, and FPV racing. So it's really, really good, useful app. You can then zoom in on the same app even further, and you can now see there, we've got the Royal Pavilion. We can start to see more individual risks associated with it. So we can now see where police stations are, schools, colleges, power pylons, power ducting stations, high intensity radio transmission areas, anything that might class as a risk to me, or vice versa, I might be a risk to them because they're sensitive. So if I just pick one of those, so just up by Victoria Gardens, you can see a scholar cap like you'd throw up in the air when you graduate university. By clicking on that, I can identify what that risk is, and it comes up as St. Giles International, which is a college. So when I'm planning my job, I'll be clicking on these various different things and working out what the risks might be and what I want to avoid. So with something like a school or a college, you know there's going to be a huge congregation of students first thing in the morning coming in and out. There's probably going to be huge congregations outside at lunchtime. So you could plan a shoot. So you might want to do it at the weekend to avoid the college altogether. You might want to do it at mid-morning or mid-afternoon and try and avoid the sort of the high-risk times, essentially. The last app that I'll go on to then is Sky Demon, and Sky Demon is available on mobile phones again, or you can use it on a desktop. And this is more like air charts. Doesn't let you zoom in anywhere near as far as Drone Assist. Isn't drone biased, it's just general aviation biased. But for me, it lets me check what airspace I'm in. So when I said at the beginning I could go over 600 feet altitude, I can only do that in certain airspaces or if I've filed a NOTAM. If I'm inside an ATC at an airport, it's actually the airport that will give me permission to go up to a different height rather than my own permit. So you can see on the top there, I've actually clicked, if I can bring my mouse across, to this bar across the top here, and that's the south side of the Gatwick airspace, which would be a Class A. So above this is Class A and below should be Class G. So that's the last bit of those two. And then from there, I would start to look at site-specific risks. So I mentioned this area early on as being national trust and a military low-fly zone. So knowing that, there's also a couple of other things to look at here. One is the terrain is quite undulating. There's a lot of hidden dips. So I wouldn't necessarily see a helicopter coming towards me until it came over the crest of the hill. So that might limit how high I want to fly, for example, or how far away from myself I want to fly. Also, you've got a lot of magnetic interference potentially from the hills themselves if they've got a lot of iron in. Some of these areas, if you go to places like Snowdonia in Wales, a lot of the mountains there, they used to take iron and core and stuff out of the hills. So you could end up with interference. So it's working out what's in the area and what could potentially affect the drone. When you then come to something like the local landmark, if you wanted to photograph it, this is a nice remote one. But now you've got an area which is open to the public. So you might want to consider, again, time of day, where you're going to stand to make sure that you don't interfere with anybody, where you're going to fly from so that you get a good line of sight. So if I wanted to do an orbit, for example, of this column, when I start going around behind it, I'm going to be hidden behind the trees and the pillar itself. So I need to think about my visual line of sight. So that might be something that I do to keep an altitude up to a certain height so that I can see the drone at all times, or I could use an observer, or I could actually walk around and follow it. When you move on to private locations, remember the place might give you permission to fly there, but you still need to get permission to fly in the airspace. They're two separate things. But if I was doing something, for example, here would be a common one, might be a wedding photography, for example. There's various things I would think about with a site like this, which is, again, where do I fly from? And then I'm going to be looking at where are the people going to be coming from? So with a building like this, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving around, but we have a door into the front of the building here. From a walk around of the building, there's actually a door on this front side towards the church. And then where this glass patio area is here is the entrance in and out of the pub, you know, into the bar area. So I'd make sure I come away a good 50 meters so that I can see both entrances and exits. So I can see people coming towards me before they're within my 50 meters. And likewise, anybody coming from this front door has to come round this corner before they can get to me. Now, things to consider if you're doing something like that is also now you're going beyond 1 or 2 people to maybe 40, 50, 200 people. You know, if you're photographing a wedding, an average wedding is 100 guests, 50 to 100 guests, you might want to think about maybe asking the venue to close one of the doors so that you've only got one attack route, as it were, for people to get to you from. So the last thing I would suggest there in general is to take somebody with you as a competent observer. There's 2 reasons for taking somebody with you. The first reason is what we were just saying there, is if you've got people that might come out of the pub area, you might just want somebody that can walk forward and stop them coming too close to you so that you can land the drone safely and be out of the way. But also the second one is you're probably going to be looking down at a screen on your app device to see what the camera sees. So you're not going to be looking up at the drone anymore. So the key thing there is you're now flying first person view. So you might not have goggles on, but because you're not looking at the drone and maintaining visual line of sight, you're now doing FPV. So using a competent observer basically covers you legally, and also it means you've got someone there to run interference if any members of the crowd come out. So thinking back to that last image there with the wedding photography as an example, think about the time of day you would do that. You don't want to do wedding photography once all 50 to 100 guests are drunk, because you will get the guy that comes out drunk as a skunk going, give us a go on your drone, mate, you know? And apparently he's probably Australian, going by the voice I just did. But having a competent observer is 2 things. One is making sure they can run interference and the legalities. And the reason I've said competent observer, you could take anybody along. You could ask one of the guests to help you out. You could ask a friend. The competent word to me, you want somebody that understands what you're looking for. So if you say to somebody, can you keep your eye out for full-size aircraft that might come into the area? The next thing you know is you get a tap on your shoulder and he's pointing at a Boeing 747 at 38,000 feet, which is nothing to do with you. You want to explain to them what you're looking for is helicopters coming through at 300 or 400 feet or aeroplanes coming through at 500, 600 feet so that they know what they're looking for. And I would also explain to them how to trigger my return to home fail-safe so that if I passed out for any reason or was rugby tackled to the ground by a drunk Australian guest, they could take over the drone and at least press the return to home button and make it land. So talking of being rugby tackled by drunken guests, be prepared for confrontation. Now, I'm not saying take boxing gloves and be ready for a fight. I'm saying that if you're going to be flying somewhere that's not a model flying club, so you're going to say, take a photograph of a landmark or a tourist attraction, or you're just going to fly from the local beach or park, you may well have somebody that comes up to you and starts going, it's illegal to fly here. You're flying over my house. You know, these are sort of examples of things we've had in the past. We had a lady in Woking who was effing and blinding at us because she was convinced we were flying over her house and spying on her. We were basically at 120 meters taking very wide angle shots with a wide angle lens. It was just the shadow of the drone from the sunlight had gone over her garden. So in her head, we're straight over her garden. First rule, don't be aggressive back. Go passive. It works really, really well. If somebody comes up to confront you, just instantly be polite. Go, certainly, how can we help? You know, and don't be afraid to land the drone, show them the photographs you're taking and explain, unless you're doing something really stupid, don't. But, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. So we always sort of say to people, yeah, if you give us a second, we'll land the drone and we'll talk to you. Any of my crew will normally come and grab me as the manager, because that always makes somebody feel better when the manager's taken the time out to come and speak to them. And, you know, it's like I say, don't be aggressive, because you'll just escalate things. And the next thing you know, it turns into a massive row. So listen to their grievance, find out what they're upset about, and then talk to them. A classic example we had here was filming for Betty, which is a Discovery Channel TV program out in America. We were flying in Cornwall recently. The production company had notified all the neighbours that we were going to be flying, but obviously the husband hadn't told the wife at one of the properties, and she came out because, yes, we were flying over her back garden. It was all fully legal, fully prepared and fully briefed, but no one had told her. So she was very upset. So we landed and we explained to her that every letter had gone round, and just by taking the time out and speaking to her and giving her a website address so that she could look up our company and so on, she went from that to about 10 minutes later coming out with a tray of biscuits and cups of tea. You know, it's because she knew she was in the wrong at that point, and she was more than prepared to be nice. The key thing is, if whatever you're going to do, just bear in mind Article 241. A person must not recklessly or negligently cause or permit an aircraft to endanger any person or property. So whatever you do, just think safety in the back of your head at all times. When it comes to doing risk assessments, Andy Simmons likes to say one here, which is that we do a risk assessment every time we cross the road. You know when you cross a road, there's going to be cars coming or cyclists or other pedestrians. You don't just walk out, you do a risk assessment. You stop, you look both ways, you listen, and then you do mitigations, which is you look and listen, and then you decide to cross the road. In a nutshell, don't be this guy. I've blurred his face out. He's taken off in the entrance to Royal Hampton Court Palace, which is, you can just see on the left-hand side of the road there, is only a few meters from a main A road. It's also directly opposite the junction to Bushy Park. You can see the pedestrian walking within a couple of feet of him there who's not paid any attention to. It's just basically anything you can do wrong is in that one photo, essentially. Just don't be that. So think safety, plan ahead, think of separation distances, consider the airspace, and know where you're flying and how you're flying. So what's the best drone? How long is a piece of string, I think, is a very, very good question there. You've got various different drones available, different payloads, different cameras. We can see here in this selection of 4, we go from GoPros up to full frame SLRs with a various selection of dedicated drone cameras in between. What I always say to people is think about what you want to capture, and that will tell you what drone to buy. So some people here might be doing survey work. We do surveying with these large drones as well, where we put a 100 megapixel medium format camera on, which we attach to GPS sensors. That's not what we want for filming. So it depends on what you want to do. Some of the smaller drones as well, like the Mavics and the Mavic Minis, they have these great functions that you can use, things like follow me, boomerang mode, selfie mode, all these different things to make it a lot easier for you to capture a fun shot if that's all you want. But again, for us doing commercial photography, it's all completely irrelevant. So when it comes to choosing a camera or a drone, for photography side of things, you probably want to think megapixels. We all understand megapixels. The more megapixels it is, the better the resolution of the image. But when it comes to videography, megapixels are actually kind of meaningless because HD is 2.1 megapixels. It's 1920 by 1080. It's 2.1 megapixels. And 4K is 4096 by 2160, which is 8.8 megapixels. So having a 50 megapixel camera does not count if you're shooting 4K. You're still only shooting 8.8 megapixels. So you might be more interested in the 2 facts there, which is bitrate and codec. Bitrate is how many megabits of information per second are recorded as part of the video format. So with a standard camera, take GoPros for example, when you're shooting HD, you're shooting around 10 megabits per second. 4K, you're shooting around 40 to 50 megabits per second. TV companies actually want a minimum of 100 megabits per second, which is why you don't get much GoPro footage going into main TV programs unless it's what we class as a B camera, a secondary camera. And then the next issue there is codec, and codec is what file format it's recorded into. So again, GoPros tend to record H.264 or H.265, which are MP4 files. They can be watched on most computers, most mobile devices, but they can also record in a format called HEVC, which you will only be able to use if you've got the right computer. But the HEVC records a higher bit rate, which for someone like me doing it professionally is something that I can then edit better at a later date. Other codecs we use in the film industry are ProRes, which is an Adobe filming profile, and we get 420, 422, and 424, which is all to do with the bit rate, which I'll come on to in a second, bit depth. And essentially it's trying to capture as much information as possible. So the cameras behind me here on these drones actually record up to 500 megabits per second, which is, as you can tell, a good 10 times higher than standard 4K. So the two things that come in between both cameras that you want to look at is bit depth. Now bit depth and bit rate sound the same, different things. It's not megabits, it's something else. Bit depth is the number of colors that the camera can record, which I'll come on to on the next slide. And the last thing is sensor size. A bigger sensor is better quality, and I'll explain why in a second. So bit depth is how many colors a sensor can record. So if you take a 10 megapixel camera or a 100 megapixel camera, it doesn't matter. Each pixel in 8-bit is capable of recording 8 zeros or 8 ones. So it becomes 2 to the power of 8, which is 256 different colors essentially. So you've got red, green and blue, which you can then cube. So 8-bit gives you 256 colors per pixel of each of the red, green and blue, which gives you about 1 million colors roughly, or 16 million colors, 16.77 million colors. There we go. When you go up to 10-bit, because you can now capture 10 zeros or ones on or off per pixel, you're at 1024 colors per pixel, which again cubed gives you a billion colors. And then 12-bit would give you sort of 4 billion colors. It's an exponential curve. But what that means, if you look at the image on the left that's marked as 8-bit, you get less chunks of the rainbow. You've got less colors to choose from. Whereas on the right, because you've got so many more colors, you can create a more gradual gradient. So when you look at the two images underneath, where you've got a very gradiented sky, when you've got 10-bit, 12-bit and more bit depth, you can get more colors of the chunks of the rainbow essentially. So on the left, you can see you start to get a slight banding of the image. So essentially, more bits, better. Sensor size, I said there that the bigger the sensor, the better. The green box there is your regular full frame sensor. And the key thing with that is that's what all camera measurements are essentially measured by, is full frame. So when somebody says, I have a 35mm lens, the 35mm lens is based against a formula for a full frame sensor. The medium format, which is the larger grey box, if anyone's a bit of a NASA nerd, it's the cameras they took to the moon when they went up there, Neil Armstrong and everything else. They had some medium format Hasselblads. We use medium format cameras for photography when we're doing drone mapping. Hasselblad H6D, it's about a £40,000 camera, but you're looking at about 8,000 pixels by 6,000 pixels. So it's an amazing resolution. When we fly at 35 meters, pointing straight down with a 50mm lens, we get 1 millimeter per pixel. So from 35 meters in the air, you can zoom in and read what brand of chewing gum wrapper is left on the floor. That's how good a quality we can look at. So when you then go down from full frame, Super 35 in purple is very common for cinema. So Red Epics and Alexa cameras are Super 35s. If anyone's got a Canon bridge camera, so things like the Canon 90D, for example, that would be the pink APS-C sensor. And then Micro Four Thirds would be a DJI Inspire GH4 camera. And then we start to come down. The orange 1-inch sensor is a Mavic 2 Pro. And the 1 2/3, which is the pastel blue towards the bottom left, that is your Mavic Pro. So you can see straight away from a Mavic Mini or a Mavic Pro to the Mavic 2, the Mavic 2 sensor is actually 4 times the size. It's twice the height and twice the width. And then the 1 to 3.2 at the bottom left corner, that's probably your mobile phone. So GoPros are the 1 to 2/3 as well. So you can see that the smaller drones like the Mavic Minis, the Mavics, their camera sensor is slightly better than a mobile phone, whereas something like the Mavic the Mavic Pro 2 is actually a significant step up in terms of sensor size. Bigger sensor, just think of the logic of putting 20 megapixels onto a sensor. If the sensor's tiny, it's got very small photo sites compared to the bigger sensor. Bigger sensor means it can absorb light better, and you get less things which we call as chromatic aberrations. And one of the slides in a minute will show you an example of what a chromatic aberration is. But also just in terms of general light acceptance and quality, the bigger sensor, the better. So when it comes to choosing a drone, think about how many megapixels you want, the bit rate, the bit depth, and the sensor size. And as you can imagine, the better you get, the more expensive they get. So when it comes to what we do as a company, we tend to fly these very large drones here, which have an interchangeable payload. So we can swap the camera for what we're doing. We can interchange the lenses and a lot more besides, which just basically means we can fine tune to what the customer wants. So the camera that's on there is a 4K cinema camera. which has a 12-bit color ratio. So it does, you know, about 1 trillion colors. It's insane for color quality. But also we've also now got manual focus on that, so we can pull focus while we're in the air, which is again another kind of video cinematography kind of thing. So in terms of choosing the best settings, you can see in the background of this image, you've got, as soon as you go manual, you've got shutter speed, aperture, ISO, white balance. You know, you've got what do you focus on, what part of the image do you focus on? Do you do a single shot, multiple shot? Do you expose for the center of the image? Do you do evaluative metering? Do you shoot in JPEG? Do you shoot in RAW? It's a huge minefield, and to be honest, I wouldn't have time tonight to go through every single setting. So the main three I would focus on is the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. And to balance the perfect image is a balance of these three. So if I was to take the shutter speed and adjust the shutter speed significantly, if I wanted to keep the ISO the same, I would have to adjust the aperture to get the same image. And if I adjust the aperture, I've got to adjust the shutter speed or the ISO. It's kind of like a freeway push and pull, where as soon as you adjust one, it needs to adjust one of the other ones. But in summary of these three, shutter speed is probably the easiest one for most people to understand. It's how quickly the camera opens and closes its iris. On digital drones, they don't tend to have physical shutters anymore. They just have an electronic pulse on or off. Now, if you've got the shutter open for 1 second, it will be open for a while. It's got plenty of time to let loads of light come in onto the sensor. The downside is it's like being back in the 1800s. Unless you keep that camera dead still and nothing in the background moves, you'll get blur. If you want to photograph something fast, like a Formula One car, you might want to be at 1,000th of a second, because it will snap very quickly so you don't get the motion blur as it comes through the image. Downside of going too high on the shutter speed, you can get some problems on the sensor where you get half the image will be completely black, and that's just basically where the shutter speed can't cope with the light coming in. ISO goes back to the older film days of cameras, and it's how sensitive the camera film was to light. So when you used to go down to the shop and buy a roll of film from Boots, you'd normally get 100 or 200, and that just meant in daylight it would normally expose fairly okay. When it got to late in the evening, you'd grab out a roll of 400 or 800. So an 800, the film was exactly the same. You were putting exactly the same image on it, but the chemicals on the film reacted quicker to light, so they exposed faster. When you come through to digital, the sensor doesn't change. It's always the same sensor, so it's a slightly different way to doing it. The sensor is no more sensitive to light. It kind of starts to calculate and adjust electronically. But in a nutshell, ISO 100 is the lowest, and that's for bright conditions. And then depending on the camera, so if something like the Mavic, for example, goes up to 1600, some of the specialist cameras we use will go up to 120 odd thousand. And if you're flying late in the evening around dusk, say sunset, you might want to be on 800 to 1600. Low light, you might want to be 16 to 3200. I would avoid, to be honest, going any higher than that, because you'll start to get a lot of graining and pixelation in the image. Aperture is then, if you think back to the old film cameras, it's the shutter inside that opens and closes, it's the iris. The aperture is in the lens, and it's the size of the hole that opens up between the lens and the sensor. So it's kind of weird, but the bigger number is smaller hole, and the lower number is a bigger hole. So F1, for example, would be fully open, whereas F22 would be a pinhole in the center. Now, if you think about how much is going to come through, if you think of a flow of water, for example, coming through a bucket, if you've got a tiny hole in the bottom, so F22, the water is going to drain through that hole very, very slowly. If you've got a huge hole at the bottom, so F1, the water is going to gush out. If you then say that that water is light, that's how quickly you can put light onto the sensor. Small hole, slowly, big hole, quickly. So with these three things, an analogy I've always done when I taught photography to students is I've had this comparison where you want to take a sponge and you want to get it perfectly wet. Now, by perfectly wet, I mean you get every aspect of that sponge wet, but when you pick it up, there's no dry patches, underexposed, and it doesn't drip water, overexposed. It is just a perfectly saturated sponge. You can do that by pouring a whole jug of water onto it very, very quickly, which would be a small aperture of around f2, but you chuck it on very quickly in 1,000th of a second, or you drip it on very slowly over a period of time through a tiny aperture over a long period of 2 or 3 seconds. So that's the two comparisons. The benefits are, if you're photographing something at high speed, high shutter speed will stop the blur. If you want the blur, so if you imagine if you watch my hands, you're following a car, you might want to track with the car and get the background blurry. You know, it's all about finding what settings work for yourself. So when it comes to photography and drones, in the background there is an image from the Mavic Mini app. And you can see on the right-hand side, you can select single, AEB, time shots, videos. There's loads of different functions you can get into. And then at the bottom underneath that, you've got J plus R, which is JPEG and RAW. So I'm shooting two types of image at the same time, as well as EV. EV is exposure balance. So EV is neutral. If you wanted to go higher or lower to cope for light, you can adjust that. But the main things you want to look at is think about how the camera and the drone work together. Now, a drone, even on a dead calm day, sitting in dead calm wind, is going to move around a little bit. If you're holding a camera with human hands, we always say that about 1/80th of a second is as steady as a human being can hold it without some form of electronic assistance. When it comes to a drone, I would say 1/100th to 1/160th of a second is about the slowest you want to go. The ISO, you want to get it as low as you can. And the reason for that is, like I said earlier, bright daylight, go straight down to 100. If it's dark or dingy light, you might want to bring it up a little bit. And then the aperture, you can adjust to create background blur. Now, f2.8 at the lower end will create background blur. So if you have a person stood in front of a building, for example, and there's, say, 20 feet of difference, on a low aperture, if you focus on the person, the building will be out of focus. If you focus on the building, the person will be out of focus. When you drag that up to f22, everything's in focus from foreground to background. It just creates what we call a wider field of view. Some of these expressions are a bit technical. If you want to go into, you'll find if you just search them on Google, you'll get some YouTube videos that will explain them quite neatly. So what you can do there is you can adjust the aperture for background blur. Now, when it comes to the ISO, I was saying there about the issues you can get if you go to high ISO. There's two images here shot exactly the same time at the same light conditions and everything else on the same aperture setting, so the same hole in the camera. On the left is an image shot at an ISO 100. Camera was actually just put down on the table, so we can get away with 1/50th of a shutter speed. It was quite slow. And on the left there is quite a nice, quite straightforward image. If you look at the right-hand side, because I brought the shutter speed right up and I haven't adjusted the aperture, I've had to correct the ISO to correct for the amount of light that's not coming in. Because I've only opened the hole very quickly, I've not let enough light in. So what I've had to do is increase the sensitivity of the sensor. And if you look closely at the image on the right, you'll see in the black areas, there's a lot of grain and pixelation to the image. And also, if you look closely, you'll be able to see some red, purple, and yellow spotting. And this is what we class as chromatic aberration. It's where the sensor can't cope with the information coming in, so it tries to make it up. So like I say, for photography, the lowest ISO you can get away with is always best, and then balance your shutter speed against your aperture if you need to. ND filters on a really, really sunny day can help. So if you take something like a Mavic out on a really, really sunny day, you might go all the way down to ISO 100, but the aperture or the shutter speed, sorry, still wants to be at 1/600th of a second to stop it overexposing. What you can do is you can put ND filters on neutral density, and an ND filter is essentially a pair of sunglasses for the camera lens, and it just darkens it down, stops the light coming in as quickly, and you can bring the shutter speed down then accordingly. ND filters are available in various different stops. So you might get an ND 8, 16, 32, 64, which equates to 3 stops of light, 5 stops, 7 stops, 9 stops, and so on. And essentially 1 stop is the equivalent of going from f4 to f5.6. It's 1 step on the settings. When it comes to another way you can cheat an image, if you want to try and get more light, is HDR, which is high dynamic range. So I mentioned briefly earlier about exposure compensation, that EV value. What this does on the left-hand side there, the top image is done at EV +1, center is EV 0, and the bottom is EV -1. So what it's doing is it's taking 3 exposure readings at 3 different settings, and then you can combine them together to create 1 image. So what you're doing, if you look at the 3 images on the left, the top image, which is highly exposed, is getting all the detail in the darker areas. And the one at the bottom, which is underexposed, is keeping all the detail in the bright areas like the sky. So when you put them together, you've got all of the imagery together. You've then got the option of shooting in JPEG or RAW. The key thing to know about these is the difference between the two. JPEG has had all of its color, detail, and information added to the file, which means it can no longer be removed. So if you want to make any adjustments to it, imagine you've ordered a painting, it's been given to you, and you decide you want to change the color of the sky, you have to paint over it. You have to actually physically modify it. Whereas RAW is much more like being given a painting by numbers. You can start from scratch with the core information of the image and change the colors before you've actually put them in there. So it just gives you a little bit more flexibility. When it comes to videography, the camera settings are slightly different because what you want to focus on more is shutter speed rather than the light, etc. Now, you'll quite often hear an expression called cinematic rule or cinematic look. This goes back to the old days when they used to hand crank the video cameras and used to have a disc spinning with half of it exposed, a quarter of it exposed, and it was classed as the degrees. Now, the common one for the cinematic look is what we call a 180-degree rule, which means when you were spinning it, half of it would have been open, half of it would have been shut. And essentially what you're looking to do is double the shutter speed to the frame rate. So if you're running 24 frames a second, you want a shutter speed of 1/48th, or on most digital cameras, you'll go 1/50th because that's the only option you'll have. If you're running 30 frames a second, you'll go 1/60th. If you're running 50 frames a second, you'll go 100th. And if you wave your hand back and forth in front of your face, you don't see a single hand, you see a blur. And that's what the cinematic look is. It's giving your eye a natural image to look at rather than something that looks like a stop motion animation. You know, when you see the creature comfort adverts with the tortoise talking and that kind of thing. You've then got the optimal ISO. So when I said for photography, go as low as you can. When it comes to filming, every camera has what they call a base ISO setting. So for most cameras like my Canon 5Ds and the Blackmagic camera that's in the background of this image, it's an ISO of 400. I can drop it to 100, but the image will actually be worse than it would be at ISO 400 because that's what the camera is designed to work at. And you'll find that nearly every camera will have a base setting, so it's worth reading the manual to find out what that is. And again, it's then down to adjusting the background by changing the aperture to decide how much blur you want. And again, you could add ND filters. So if you find you're way off on the settings, you can apply an ND filter. And you can also use polarizing filters, which are good for a polarizing filter, works on reflective surfaces like water, windows, for example. When you come to video, I said about JPEG and RAW. When it comes to video, you have an edited video essentially that comes out of the camera pre-colored, or you can shoot log. So if you take most of the DJI drones, they'll shoot D-log, Panasonic is P-log, Canon is C-log, they've all got their own names for it. And what we're doing when we shoot log is we're trying to capture more dynamic range by essentially compressing the color ratios. So what the camera does in log is it takes 90% or 50% of the color detail out, and you end up with this very gray washed out image. And then when you go back later on, you add something called a LUT, which is a lookup table, where it takes a formula, looks at the image and goes, okay, so that was calculated at that. I'm going to calculate it back now and put the color back, and you end up with a colored image. Benefits of log, if you're someone like myself that is giving footage to a production company and they want to match what we've shot from the air with what they shot on the ground, shooting in log gives a color grader somebody a lot more to work with after it's been shot. So again, it's a little bit like that JPEG versus RAW. Log is like shooting RAW. You're taking more basic information that can be modified, whereas the pre-shot video, pre-saturated video is like shooting a JPEG. Once it's done, it's kind of done. So this leads you to dynamic range. So this is the benefit of shooting log. Essentially, log expands our dynamic range. So with these two lovely pictures of my sofa that my dog has dented, I've just noticed, there's a dent in the back. My dog sits on the sofa to look out the window. In the left-hand image, if I expose for the interior of the room, you can see that the window is just completely white, washed out and overexposed. If I go to the right-hand side and expose for outside of the window, the inside of the room is now too dark. And this is what we call dynamic range. So if you look at the grade underneath, we've got 20 stops from black to white. It's not as simple as this, but this is a kind of way of dumbing it down, essentially. if you took 11 stops, it can capture 11 of those stages from black, but it can't go all the way to white. It can go just beyond halfway. If your camera does 14 stops of dynamic range, it will go further, 16 stops further. So cameras like the Red Epics, which started around 30, 40, 50,000 pounds, are 17 stops, 16, 17 stops of dynamic range, whereas most cameras that you buy are about 11 stops of dynamic range. The white balance, to be honest, with a drone, I would suggest most of the time, if you're flying in the daylight, you either put it on auto or start at around 5,500 as a setting. Now, what white balance is a Kelvin rating essentially from infrared to ultraviolet. So 1,000 is infrared, 20,000 is ultraviolet. And as the sun moves through the atmosphere, so from low in the morning in the day through to late in the evening, the light is coming through more atmosphere, it's bouncing off different things, so you get different ratings of coolness. Also, if you're shooting in different lighting, so if you, for example, filming indoors with a camera, you might be in artificial lights like fluorescent light tubes, tungsten lights, different types of light bulbs. And you'll also find with lights, if you look at the LEDs on the wall behind me there, they can be set to cool white or warm white, and that's yellow or white, or essentially blue. And that's essentially what you're looking at on this chart. So what you'll find when you're filming with a drone, most of the times you'll be out in the daylight, it's going to be between 5,000 and 6,000. It's very rare that you're going to need to change it much beyond that. What we tend to do when we're filming professionally is we can use white balance cards. You can get some, if you haven't got a white balance card, a great way to do this is just a sheet of very clean white paper. Yeah, so you can put an image in there. So you can take one sample image with the card in, and what these color charts are is they're a pre-set, pre-programmed list of specific colors in the industry. So they're always exactly the same from brand to brand. And then across the bottom, you've got white, 20% gray, 40% gray, 60, 80, and 100% black. So again, different cameras measure white balance in different ways. So I know one person in advance was quite curious about how to set the white balance. The issue with how to set the white balance is I could sit here for half an hour, 50 times telling you how to do it on each different camera because they're all different. But the core way of doing it is essentially the same, which is you take an image like this, where you have something that you can go back to later, which I'll show you in a bit, where you can select a certain item to bring the color to a predetermined point. Not all cameras are the same, so it's worth bearing that in mind. The next item on the agenda, as it were, is being creative. So just because your camera has, or drone has the camera, doesn't mean you can't take a photo of the drone and do it the other way around. So the white blur in front of me there on the beach is actually a small F450 drone with some LEDs on it. And it's quite easy to kind of go out and be creative with the drone and take light paintings. So one that's quite popular with things like the Mavics is you could put a light on the drone and then get it to do an orbit, a circle around something, and then you can put halos around stuff. So again, there, the light trail, that is actually a drone going backwards and forwards over a beach. So you're lighting up the water as it comes over the sand. Shutter speed of about 8 seconds for that image on a camera on a tripod, and it's the drone that's moving. So it's just a different way of thinking. Tilt shift photography. If you go back, tilt shift is where you have lenses that have a hinge in them. Now, tilt shift on a drone itself is not something you can practically do, because once the drone's at 400 feet, it's very hard to reach it and adjust the angle of the lens. Tilt shift was originally invented for fixing architecture photography. If you stood between two tower blocks and look up, you get that problem that you get when you look down the railway lines, where the buildings will converge as they go upwards. What tilt shift was a way of doing was making it visually straight. Yeah, so it was a way of distorting the image as it came through. But what you can do electronically using programs like Photoshop and Lightroom is put in an electronic tilt shift, which basically increases the amount of focus change in the background and foreground and can make things look like they're miniature models, which is what I've done with Ironbridge at the very beginning there. You could also stitch together a load of images to make a 360. So again, these are very good on Facebook, where if you've got a mobile device, you can hold the phone, move the phone around, and you can actually look around the image just by twisting the phone. And as you can see here, that big image on the bottom is actually made of 24 smaller images from just above. You could then take one of those 360 images and wrap it into a ball. So what I've done here is used a little bit of editing in Photoshop and twisted that round. One thing to be aware of if you want to do shots like this is you probably need something called EXIF Maker. EXIF adds metadata to the image, which helps Photoshop manipulate the image. So what you have there is the image from the left, which was the shot from the previous photo, looking up and down the 7 in both directions, just rotated around and gives you kind of a fun way to do things. So in terms of image editing, most computers, most mobile phones will give you a basic level of photo editing. I've got an iPhone 10, which is probably a couple of years old for most people now, and I can do quite a lot of editing on there. You can buy dedicated apps for most computers, but the big ones that most people want to know about is Photoshop and Lightroom, which are the two that you can get from Adobe. The differences between these two are they're very similar, but they're very different at the same time, and it does depend what you want to do with them. Both of them will do basic photo editing, but if all you want to do is just color correct and maybe fix a few little spots and marks and blemishes on the images, then Lightroom is absolutely all you need. You don't need to go mad with Photoshop. Photoshop is more about complete photo manipulation, taking the background out, putting in a different background, changing colors, you know, really going to town and going nuts with it. But both of these programs will edit raw images that you bring in. The video editing side of things, this was just an example of my video suite that I use. It's the other end of my office I'm sat in at the moment. I have 3 screens, looks very greedy, I know. The left screen there is just doing a live view of what I'm editing. So this is the BMFA video I've just edited for the helicopter review, achievement scheme. The middle is my timeline of what I'm editing, and the right is all the components and bits and pieces that I'm editing in and cutting and splicing. So my wife goes horse riding and she likes to take a GoPro on the camera, and so she's got a Mac and she just uses iMovie just to slice bits together and put things together. Whereas if you're doing serious video editing, you might want to invest in something like Premiere Pro, which is what this is. And there's also a program called After Effects. And if anybody's watched the Achievement Scheme videos where you've got the logo animated in and stuff like that, that's done in After Effects. After Effects isn't for really editing video, it's after editing, it's editing stuff to add on. So that's pretty much where I am in terms of def by PowerPoint. So what I was going to drop out now was hopefully, if I might need to swap screens, Andy, in a second, I was going to show everyone just a quick demonstration of Lightroom and Photoshop. So if I drag, there we go. I'm just going to try and bring this onto the right screen.
While Chris is doing that, I've just put the link to the helicopter air video that he mentioned in the chat, if anybody wants to have a watch of that afterwards.
Yeah. I'm just going to share screen so I can share my laptop screen because it's a little bit better, I think. That said, it's crashing on me, so let's do it that way around. Let's do it that way. So this is Lightroom. It's a little bit compressed because of the way I'm running it on the screen. But essentially what you can do here is you can select add photos and go into your desktop. And what I've got here on the screen, I've got one that's, you can see straight away is massively overexposed, one that's a little bit dark, and one in the middle. And I can essentially select these images and review for import, and it will bring them in, and then I just need to add them in. And now they're in here. On this right-hand side is my basic windows. This top one is the develop window, and it will bring up various bits and pieces here, for example, with light, color, effects. So they're the kind of things that I can do. And that's pretty much my limit for Lightroom. It's not a massive amount. I can do cropping. I can do healing brush. Healing brush is, let's say you've taken a photo of a bride at a wedding and she's got a pimple on her face. You can go in there with a healing brush and just take the pimple off her face for her. There's some other bits and pieces down here, but the main ones that you would be interested in as an editor would be color and light. So if I select one of these images here, if I turn the film strip off, this is, actually we'll go to the massively overexposed one. So this is clearly quite overexposed. There's very little in the sky. Now, if this was a JPEG, this would be unfixable because the white is gone. There's nothing there to recover. All you've got is white. The benefit of shooting in RAW, if I just hit the auto button very quickly, you can see that it will bring back a lot of detail. And we've actually got a few clouds down here in the sky that weren't visible a second ago. So that's the power of RAW over JPEG. Now, what we can do here when we come into light, this is by clicking on auto, these are the settings that it adjusted. So straight away, we said this was massively overexposed. So we can bring this exposure down, or likewise, if it was underexposed, we could bring it up. So by bringing that down straight away, we can start to see that we've fixed most of the problems with this image. We can increase contrast or decrease contrast, depending on what look we're looking for. So something to look at on this would be my shirt stood in the middle there. If I go high contrast, we lose the wrinkles in the shirt. Low contrast, we get to see more detail. Highlights on this image would be probably this white area of the floor to anything that's overexposed in the sky. And by bringing the highlights up and down, you can see that we're bringing some detail back in and out. Shadows would be the opposite, so it's the dark end. So it'd be Craig's clothing here, my clothing in the shadows. So again, you bring the shadows up, you can see we bring detail back into the clothing or down. And white, obviously anything to do with white, as the name suggests, so we can fix a few bits there. And blacks is the black area. So you can see in the background on the high horizon there, we can make the trees very dark or we can brighten them up. If I go back to one of these images that's probably a little bit more normal. So here we go, we have the picture of me. If you can stomach looking at my face for a few more seconds. If I bring the exposure up just a little bit, I get a nice kind of exposure on the drone, but now the side of this car is looking a little bit too shiny for my taste. So I can use my contrast tab to bring that shine back out of the car. I could tweak the contrast just a little bit. And one of the benefits of the contrast is it will push some of the background away from me. If you go too far with contrast, I don't know if you can see, we start to get vignetting around the outside of the corner images here, which is where it kind of brings in too much darkness. With the shadows, I could bring the shadows down because I'm not interested in the wheel well of the car and I'm not interested in the background so much. And by just making a few more tweaks, we've got quite a nice color there. Then you've got the color tab underneath. And the color tab we can use to fix the Kelvin rating, which was the white balance, so the temperature of the image, and tints. Now, tint is an odd one. A lot of cameras will sometimes add a red hue to an image, some will add green. So, for example, a lot of the Sony A7 series cameras add a little bit of green to their images. Canon are guilty of adding quite a bit of magenta to their images. So this just lets you go one way or the other. So just to give you an example, we can go very green or very purple. And that's really just to help fix an image. The temperature here, we can go from very cold to very hot. And this is, if you think back to those days when you used to get your film images back from Boots, you'd get some that were very orange. And that's where the white balance was way off. Now, the quickest way to fix white balance is if we had that sheet of A4 white paper in the image, or we had the color card, we could use this eyedropper tool and actually look for something here in the image that we know of is white. Now, it might be tempting to go up here to the top left corner and grab a piece of the sky, but because I know that's very heavily exposed, I know Lightroom will reject it for being too bright. So what I'm actually going to look for, I don't know if you can see just here on the leg of the drone, is a small antenna, which I know is white. So I can hover over this until I see it white. If it's a bit too wide, so I'm just going to drop the eyedropper and zoom in. There we go. So if I now bring my eyedropper over here to where I know it's white, what I'll do is a proof of point. Let's move the color temperature way off. Grab my eyedropper and click on there. It's going to bring me back to an image now that is the perfect white balance because it's been balanced against something that is measured as white. So from that color card that I showed you earlier, depending on what camera you're using, you could use the mid-tone gray if that's what your camera wants to use. You could use the magenta or the cyan, or you could use the white. So just having one image at the beginning. So if you were doing a wedding and you knew you were going to shoot all your shots in the same level of light, just take a photograph of a white piece of paper just for the one photograph, and you can use that to get your white balance, which you can then apply to all the other images as you go through. Underneath, vibrance and saturation. That's the vibrance of the color and then how much of the color. So if you look at the background and the things that are orange, we can add quite a lot more color, or we can take all the color away near enough. So I know from experience with my Canon, it's about 30 is a good number for that. And then saturation, again, go too high, colors will look very artificial, but again, go too low, it looks black and white. So again, I know that for my Canon that 15 is a fairly good number for that type of image. So when you're looking at that drone picture there on the bonnet now, I think it's quite a nice looking image for my taste. If I use down here, I can actually show you what it looked like before and what it now looks like. So you can see we've gone from a fairly flat image to quite a colourful image, where the drone is now kind of the focus of the background there, essentially. And that's the same for any of the images. If I go back to here and select these three and just remove them from this, what you can also do with here is batch editing. So if I take these images, this was the Iron Bridge shot at the beginning. So you can see here, each of these images is slightly off. If I add those into Lightroom and select them all, by right clicking, I can do photo merge, and then I've got options for an HDR merge, panorama, or an HDR. So this would just be a panorama. I can grab these and it will start to bring them in. I've got the option to go spherical, cylindrical, or the one at the bottom, which I can never remember the names of. But essentially the one we'd be looking for would be spherical. But if I wanted to, before I go in, I can see by selecting these tabs what it would do to the image. And you can see there spherical was less compressed. And we'll hit merge. And what it will now do is it will take those 9 photos and turn them into a single image. There we go. Which I can then go into the develop settings with. And first thing I might want to do is just crop it down so that I get rid of some of the background off it. You have to bear with me this because I'm using a secondary screen, it's killing me a little bit. So there we go. So straight away now I've got rid of a lot of the background issues with that image. And then same as everything else from before, I can sort of go through my color editing, so I could edit it automatically, go black and white. Essentially you can do everything you want to do with it. What I would say to anybody looking to do photo editing is there is a mass of video tutorials on YouTube that you can go through for doing certain things with certain images. So that's really the benefit of Lightroom. The bit that's gone missing off the bottom of the screen would be the film strip. What you can do with the film strip is you can then copy and paste that setting. So if you make a load of adjustments to one image, you can copy it and paste it to all the other images in the film strip. Photoshop, on the other hand, if I bring this one round, is slightly different in terms of what you're ending up doing with the image. And on here, you can see straight away up on this side here, I've got adjustments. So I could go into things like exposure, the contrast, the hues, the saturation. So a lot of the stuff that's there in Lightroom is still here in Photoshop. But one of the key difference up here on Window and Workspace is you can go into graphics, painting, photography, and all sorts. So if I was editing this as a photograph, I could go into the photography settings, and now all of the tools down here on the left are to do with photo editing. So this is an example of one that I've previously edited. And on the left-hand side here, you can see the original image. And on the right-hand side, you can see how I've edited it using Photoshop. So my rucksack and my coat have been changed to red. Is it going to let me zoom in? There we go. So if we have a look at the bits in this image that I don't like, I've got a rucksack in the foreground. I've got another hiker sticking his head over the side here that I don't want in the image. The rucksack's blue. I've got an aeroplane up here in the sky that I don't want because it's a corporate image. So I can Photoshop that out of the sky. My coat now is red. I've put my name on the back of it. I've put logos onto the bag as if it's a corporate uniform. The rucksack's gone from the foreground and the hiker's gone from down here. So these are some of the tools that you can use when you're editing. And they're all down here. So let's say I'm going to put a mark, go back to this left side. I want to get rid of that aeroplane out of the sky. You could use the healing tool. Okay, it's not going to let me do it to that one because I've already compressed the image. Essentially, if you bring in a raw image, you can edit them a lot more. So we'll do sample images. Open that with Photoshop. So this is me now bringing a raw into Photoshop. I'll drag that onto the screen. So let me move it. Yep, there we go. So the moment I try and bring a image into Photoshop from a RAW, you can see it's pretty much giving me the Lightroom panel. I've got the exposure and everything down here. And that's what you then end up doing, but it's killing me with the screen. Unplug that one. Right. Which screen are you looking at the moment, Andy?
We're not looking at any screen, Chris.
Yeah,
There we go. Sorry, I've got it back. Yeah.
Sorry, my microphone.
Right. I don't know if you can see. Can you hear me now?
Yep, all good.
Yeah. Can you see the Kanku car?
We can.
You can. Brilliant. Okay. So I've unplugged the other screen. So if I bring in a image to Photoshop, it brings up this panel when you bring in a RAW file. And essentially this is a bit like Lightroom. You've got exposure settings, everything down here. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to click a quick auto and be lazy, just that we bring it in. And then we click open and it will go into the Photoshop screen eventually. I wonder if we're getting some gremlins coming back in again from earlier. It's crashed.
I think we need a separate session on the photo editing. I've learnt more tonight in those 5 minutes on Lightroom than I have with all my hours playing around with it.
Yeah.
Chris, do you fancy a few questions before you
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Because we've got 12 questions here, and I just thought we'd go through. We can take you a little bit back to the start of your presentation. Alan Clark is asking, leaving aside issues of simple courtesy, etc., and assuming you give due attention to privacy and fly under Article 17, observing the drone code, can a rural landowner prevent you flying over their property?
It means Article 16.
Yeah. For myself as a permit holder, no. But for anybody operating as a hobbyist, you need to think about what category you're in. So my operational authorization actually allows me to do overflight. I have to maintain a minimum separation. So for your average drone operator, it'd be 50 meters. So if they're 51 meters above the house they're flying over, then yes, but that's because of the permit. When you come back to the Article 16 in the open category, a lot of the separation distances are what are called lateral separation distances. So in other words, horizontal from side. So you can't go within 50 meters horizontally, let alone over. So yeah, that's kind of the nutshell there. You need to look at what category you're in and so on. But in terms of a landowner stopping you from overflying, this comes a lot with the National Trust, because I said they don't let you fly off National Trust property. So what most of us commercial operators do is we take off next door and fly in.
I think that's the answer to Colin's question, actually. How did you manage to get permission from the National Trust?
Well, that particular one, we did actually work with the National Trust. So we're a company that don't tend to do shortcuts. So we've done quite a few jobs with the National Trust, including a few down on the South Coast. You'll find a lot of companies have a drone department now. So if you want to fly within 50 meters of a railway, for example, there's a chap called Paul Linder, who is the drone rep for Network Rail. So definitely speak to him. So coming back to the guy earlier that was flying next to a road, for example, that kind of rogue shot I showed you there that was flying within a few meters of a road. It's not just about thinking safety of what you're doing. You might cause an accident by somebody being distracted. If you fly too close to a road, a car driver might be looking at the drone and run into the back of somebody else or hit a pedestrian. And it's the same thing with things like Network Rail. You don't want to fly close to a railway and distract a train driver who should be looking out for a red light on his railway line, you know. So when you're thinking safety, don't just think about your own actions, think about the impact on other people.
Thank you. Yeah, Terry Dingley asked, do you think the drone sector still has opportunities for drone work in the UK, or is it oversubscribed now?
Okay, I get this question an awful lot. I probably get somewhere in the region of 20 emails a week from people that want to work for me, which is nice. And I say the same thing to everybody. The drone industry is only going to grow. It's only going to get bigger. There's more and more opportunities. There's more and more people realizing, actually, I don't need to put scaffolding up to go up to the 5th floor of this building and look at a drain pipe. I can send a drone up and back in 5 seconds. What is important is a business plan. So whenever someone says to me, should I open a business and is there still work available? Yes, there is, but it's not a magic wand. You know, you don't buy a drone and money grows on a tree. If you don't have a business plan, you'll be out of business in less than 3 months. You just won't get any work. So it comes back to a little bit about what I said about how to choose the best drone. Don't buy anything, don't do a course until you've worked out who you're going to market and sell to, and you've got a market available to sell to. So a couple of my friends have got into this, and they've worked out a niche market, they've worked out who their customers are going to be, and then they've worked out from what their customer is going to be, what data they need to record or capture, which then indicates what camera or sensor they need, which indicates what drone they need, which indicates the way they go. So yes, plenty of work available, but it's not money growing on trees. It is still hard work, same as any business.
Brilliant, thank you. Russ Bowie, similar sort of theme. I don't believe you can fly for money or do any commercial work using the BMFA Article 16 authorisation. Are you sure you can?
Not with the Article 16, no. You'd have to go to the open category CAP 722. And like I said in the presentation, your BMFA insurance does not cover you for commercial activity. You need insurance that complies with EC 785/2004, spot the nerd. And there's quite a few companies, Cover Drone, Moonrock, that all do insurance. And if you're at entry level and you don't want to go massive, my insurance policy as an example is about £2,500 a year. You can do pay-as-you-go insurance through companies like Moonrock, where you pay like 30 quid just for that one day. So it's a cheaper way of doing it.
Brilliant. And what about the Robert Stanford? Does the DJI Mini 2 or HDR combining in camera? Does the DJI Mini 2 do HDR combining in camera?
The Mini 2, yes, it does composites. So with the Mini 2, you're linking it through your mobile phone most of the time. And what you can do in the app is you can actually have it so that it automatically uploads to your mobile phone all the images, including the compressed HDR image, or you can have it just recorded on the memory card, or both. So the one I did at Ironbridge there was, so all those shots at Ironbridge at the beginning, they were shot on the Mini 2 using, so the 360 one was Mini 2, the composite was Mini 2, the tilt shift was Mini 2, etc. and so on.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, Paul Kenyon asks, any recommendations on where to find free of charge LUTs for use?
Yeah.
What's a LUT?
Yeah.
A LUT is a lookup table. So when you shoot log, which is the video format, you end up with a very compressed, very grey, washed out looking image. When you apply a LUT, when you buy something like Premiere Pro as a video editing software, there are a handful in there for free. A lot of the camera manufacturers, when you buy a camera, so for example, the 5D Mark IV that we use quite a lot, they don't have log fitted them as standard. You have to send the camera back to Canon, pay £100 and have it uploaded onto there. You can then download free of charge off the manufacturer a set of LUTs for the Canon 5D Mark IV. So most of the manufacturers provide their own LUTs. Otherwise, it's a case of going on to some of the YouTube videos. There's quite a few of the, what they're called, YouTube celebrities, as it were, that do lookup tables that you can get. Rec 709 tends to be a very accessible free one. But Rec 709 is a very heavily saturated image, in my opinion. So yeah, it's personal taste. You can also create your own LUTs. So if you use a program like Premiere Pro, if once you've done a load of editing to it, you could store it as its own lookup table. The other one I do that with is a program called DaVinci Resolve, which you get free with Blackmagic cameras. DaVinci is very good just for doing the color grading. So sometimes I'll bring stuff in through DaVinci, color grade it, and then take it out and edit it in Premiere. So it's a case of using multiple programs.
Brilliant, thank you. Ian Haslam, I love the night shot you took. Are there any restrictions around nighttime flying? Really good question, that.
It used to be, if you were on a permit for commercial operation, you had to apply for it. The important thing to remember is when you're flying at night, the drone isn't visible to other aircraft. So one of the things you might want to consider is putting a light on the drone. And just grabbing this out of my suitcase from behind, I don't know if people can see that on my screen. It's a bicycle light. This actually has a little rubber band, so I can put it around the arm of a drone and it will stay on there. It also slides out and it will slide into a mount, but these are very bright little LEDs, you know, and you put one of those on the drone and people are going to see it from a distance. So it's back to your safety planning, where you're flying, you know, are you visible to other aircraft is the key thing to think about with that. But no restrictions that I'm aware of.
Brilliant. On a similar sort of line, Robert Hutchinson, can you offer any tips of getting the best results during the golden hour, morning and evening? Or golden hours, yeah. My main drone is a Mavic 2 Pro.
Mavic 2 Pro, fantastic drone for a start. In terms of golden hour, normally for the golden hour, it's a tricky one with a drone, because if I was doing landscape photography, for example, I might be slowing the camera shutter speed down to anything from 1/10 of a second or even 2 or 3 seconds exposure, but with an ND filter on it, because I'm trying to really slowly bring the light in. The issue with a drone is the drone is moving around. So when you go below 100th of a second, you're going to start to get a load of blur. So the best advice I could give for a Mavic 2 Pro is you can get some good ND filters for about £150 for a set of 4. You might want to just put a good ND filter on so that you can adjust it and play with it, or a polarizing filter even. Otherwise, it's coming back to things like Photoshop and Lightroom and playing with the settings afterwards. You know, get a good, if you shoot RAW rather than JPEG, you can get a lot of core information which you can then manipulate to get a better image.
Brilliant, thank you. Paul Kenyon, any tips for shooting in snow, cold temperatures? So you're getting the two extremes here now. I think white balance, difficult to get good white, even with a paper, and battery life specifically.
Yeah, key issues, battery life. The one thing to be aware of with nearly every drone on the market, they'll have an operating temperature of, most of them are around 0 degrees to 40 degrees. Some of the newer ones are going down to -10. What I found, even with the DJI stuff, the coldest we've worked on was with Big Bertha up here, which is one of the big drones. We did Dancing on Ice in Manchester. It was -7 air temperature, and we're stood on an ice rink. And we had to do a bit of a Mr. Miyagi from the old Karate Kid, you know, rub your hands together, build up some heat, and hold it onto the speed controllers a few times because it kept coming up with errors. But in terms of flying in the cold, yeah, battery life, get your batteries, keep them warm. Did a job in Reading a couple of years ago where it was -2, but they had a little coffee shop around the corner. So we took the batteries and we put them on top of their coffee percolator machine, you know, their espresso machine, because it was creating a little bit of heat, kept the batteries warm. When we were flying the prototype for the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the batteries were the size of a briefcase. So we were keeping those on heated seats in the car, in a heated car, you know, so to keep the batteries warm. In terms of best light settings, you're probably going to be in the higher Kelvins, the 6,000 area, because you're into most wintry days are cloudy. You know, if you've got snow, it's cloudy and overcast. If it's not, then you're going to be into the high sunshine. So you might want to drop to sort of 4.5 or even 4,000, and then start there as your base Kelvin or base white balance even.
Brilliant.
The hardest thing is probably focus. Find something you can create contrast. A lot of drone focuses use contrast. So dark area to white area. So if you've got everything is white, you need to try and find something dark to point the focus at to get a base focus setting.
Brilliant, thank you. Kevin Ross, what radio control systems do you select to ensure reliable comms, i.e. do you use duplex systems to protect third-party risks and protect your investment?
Very much depends on the aircraft we're flying. The silver cases across the top of my head here have all my transmitters in, and you can see there's quite a lot of them, and each of those cases has 2 transmitters. So some of them, for the bigger DJI drones, they're actually bespoke, you know, set transmitter for the drone. And then I use Futaba for the rest of them, to be honest, and Spectrum as well. So there isn't really a right or wrong. It's a case of just checking and being due diligent as you go along.
Brilliant. Robert Stanford, I find composing stills using a drone problematic compared to terrestrial compositions. Where you have fewer positions to compose a shot from, do you have any tips or rules that help when composing aerial stills?
Shoot as you go up is a good starting point. So when I see a lot of my sort of lower level competitors, they go straight to 400 feet and try and do everything from 400 feet because it's an aerial shot, so you have to go high, yeah? No, start at 5 or 6 feet and work your way up. So the one that's on the screen, if it's there, the Kanku, you can see there we've started at 5 feet and then we've gone up from there. There's a shoot I'm doing for a university where they want to try and get the whole campus in. They want us at 600 feet so they can get a really big wide angle. What we'll do when we do that is we'll take a shot at 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet, and just, you know, take regular shots as we go up, and then move around. if you've got the ability to change lenses, that's always a good thing. But obviously, a lot of the smaller drones like the Mavic Pros and the Minis, you can't change the lens. The only thing you can do is fly closer, essentially. But yeah, but take shots as you go up is my best advice there.
Great stuff. Robert Stanford, is monitor stroke printer calibration important when editing?
Yes. in a nutshell. If you're just doing some photos, let's say you're doing wedding photography, you know, every wedding photographer has their own style and their own way of doing things and their own taste. So that's more important than the calibration. When you're trying to match one set of footage to another set of footage, that's when a calibrated monitor is critical. So for some of the things, we might do a commercial video, for example, where we're doing loads of ground video from one camera, some aerial video from another camera, and we want them to look the same color, temperature, and warmth and feel, then yeah, calibrated monitor is quite critical. But for most people, probably not.
Yeah, a good question here. What I was going to actually ask you, but Richard Fellender, do you recommend apps like Litchi to fly automatically on shots like orbit around points of interest?
To be honest, DJI's got very good now, so they've got their own orbit modes and stuff like that. I would always use the manufacturer's modes before a third-party mode. Litchi is very, very good. It's just the fact that you're using a third-party app on an aircraft. So some of the jobs we might do, for example, would be a regular survey job of a building site during construction. So you go down once a month for a year and a half from start to finish, and we're trying to take the same shots from the same location every time. So we might run that through something like Litchi, where when we do it the first time, we record it as we go, and then the second time we can do it again. I tend to use Ground Station Pro from DJI for a lot of my pre-programmed flights, and that's mainly just because it's proprietary to the drone that we're using for that flight.
Lisette asks, hopefully I've got the pronunciation right there. I'm a portrait photographer, and I currently dove into drone world. I currently just got a Mavic 2 Air drone. Can you recommend the best training to start with?
In terms of flying it, I would say join your local model flying club for two reasons. One is you've got a safe environment to fly in, loads of space, very little to go wrong. But also you're going to find model flyers that can help you balance control between things like aileron and rudder and give you some useful tips. If it's the theoretical and the licensing side of things, when it was the NQE days, nationally qualified entities, there was over 32, I think, at one stage. When I did my training back in the day, it was you had the choice between Euro USC, Euro USC, or if you wanted to, you could go to Euro USC. So we didn't have any choice. Nowadays, you're on to something called an RAE, because all the NQEs ended on the 31st of December and became RAEs. It's a case of speaking to them and asking them what they provide. So I'm going to drop a couple of names. Copters are pretty much a lot of ex-military guys, very, very good, very DJI biased, and also a little bit biased at mapping. So if you wanted to get into, if you had a kind of a head that learned from military type PDF bombardment and you wanted to do a mapping sort of job or career, then Copters would be a really good example, as would HeliGuy. If you're looking more into photography for landscape, for example, or videography like I do, then you might want to look at a company like UAV Academy, which is a little bit more kind of general. One thing you want to ask any of the training companies is what support they offer. If you're just doing an A2 CFC, it's pretty much just an online theory test, very similar to the RCC test, but with a few other categories. If you're doing the GVC, which is the General Visual Line of Sight Certificate test, which is to get you up to an operational authorization and doing CAA stuff, as it were, the commercial kind of flying, you want to find a company that gives you support in writing your operations manual, which you have to submit as part of your application to the CAA, and just general support year on year, because every year you have to update your manual when you renew your application to the CAA. So it's good to have a company you can go back on for more help.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. We've got 4 more questions, and then we'll start to wrap things up with Paul Kenyon. How does water surface affect the height sensors on a drone? I worry that flying over water could end in disaster.
If you're using something like a Mavic Pro, Inspire 1, something like that, that's got the visual down position sensor, just screws them up completely. So I always switch it off. GPS isn't affected too much by water unless you're within about 2 meters. So if you're trying to fly down, it's a hard one because all my pilots, everyone that flies for me holds a B certificate for helicopters or multi-rotors from the BMFA. So they're quite advanced at flying manually. So we tend to switch a lot of the electronics off and fly in ATI mode, or even occasionally with the FPV drones, full manual. But yeah, so the visual sensors are messed up by water. So my advice would be go into the settings and switch them off and fly it slightly more manually.
Thank you. Kevin Watson, the CAA classification of drones refers to legacy aircraft. So in 2023, will such legacy drones only be able to be operated in A3, far away from people category, question mark?
Good question. So just to expand on legacy aircraft, for those that might not understand, you've got the A1, A2 and A3 categories. If you take the A2 category will allow you to fly up to 4 kilos, provided the drone is classified as a C2, which is a bit like having a European standard. The C2 means it will have a slow speed mode, it will have some other bits and pieces to meet the categories. At the moment, none exist. So we have these things called legacy aircraft, which means you can fly up to 2 kilos in the same category as the A2. So essentially that's where you're at. So things like the Mavic Pro, for example, is about the sort of 800, 900 grams. So it would come into that category. Now, as of 2023, the laws change again, and essentially all these old legacy aircrafts will get pretty much shoved into the A3 category. Yeah.
There is an exception to that, of course, for BMFA members.
Oh, the Article 16, of course, yes.
Under Article 16, yeah.
Yeah, the Article 16.
Last two questions.
Sorry, Mark, just to say really quickly, with the A3 legacy there, when you come to doing an operational authorization, there's nothing to say if you're doing it commercially like ourselves. The operational authorization is based on a risk assessment that you write to the CAA. So if you can still justify that your aircraft is safe to use, you can carry on using it, but that's more commercially biased than hobbyist. Sorry.
No, it's good. Thank you. Mark Heffer, do you sharpen any images?
I tend to try and get my focus right first time.
I knew that one. I knew you were going for that. Look, and the last question.
I'll just say sharpening an image is probably a personal taste thing. You know, I know a lot of wedding photographers. I know quite a few that will sharpen because it kind of sharpens up and kind of creates a bit more contrast and a bit more saturation in the images. And some like to soften it because it gives a more romantic feel. It's a personal taste. I personally don't sharpen anything, but that's just me.
Yeah, Paul Hart with the last question here, and it was one that we raised with you right at the start here. How do you get those images, like your opening photo and the train station, built up like make them look like models? I think you said it was tilt shift, wasn't it?
Yeah. Can you see my screen and what I'm doing on the screen? Still?
No, I stopped your screen sharing when we moved to the questions. You'll have to bring it back.
Okay. Let's see where we are.
While we're talking, Chris is getting that sorted, I'll just give a plug for next week. Again, we're off fixed wing next week as well, and introduction to RC helicopters and helicopter competitions with somebody a lot of you will know, Dave Fisher. So that should be rather enthralling, and should be very interesting.
I think you got that wrong way around. Next week is drone racing with the BDRA.
Oh, is it? Have we got to flip over? I thought it was that, but.
No, it's drone racing with the BDRA next week.
It is indeed. Well, it's still not fixed wing, so there we go. I'm quarter right, a little bit right there.
I've just put link to Chris's website in the chat. Robert was asking.
In terms of showing you a tilt shift, my screen's locked up on me again, like it did earlier.
Well, I think, Chris, this is all about sometime in the summer we need to get you back on a little bit more specific, because actually, you know, there's a lot of technical chat going on there, and I think you've really you've got everybody sort of talking about it. So, you know,
in terms of tilt shift, it's a feature in Photoshop where on the top menu you have filter, and you can go down and you select. You go into blurs, and it's actually a type of blur, so you can do radial blur, Gaussian blur, various different ones. But the tilt shift essentially is a type of blur. You drop it to where you want on the screen, and it creates a line across the screen. And then you can move lines up and down to where you want the blur to start, stop, how much blur you want, and bits and pieces like that. So again, YouTube would be a great source. If you Google how to do tilt shift in Photoshop on YouTube, you'll find there's probably 100 tutorials you could watch as well.
Can you do it in Lightroom, or does it have to be Photoshop?
I've never tried in Lightroom. I think it's probably a Photoshop one. But again, if you Google, can I do tilt shift in Lightroom, you'll probably find the answer to that one. For me, my background before photography is I still am a graphic designer, but I used to teach graphic design and photography at a university. And essentially I was an Adobe certified tutor. So all the Adobe software, basically I was not only qualified in using, I was actually certified by Adobe to instruct. So for me, I use the specific programs. Each program has its unique speciality. So you can go into one program and do a lot of what you want, but then I tend to take elements. So when I'm putting a video together, I might create an illustration in After Effects, which is based on drawings that I created in Illustrator from text that I created in InDesign, which is then all put through After Effects to bring back into Premiere Pro. If I don't like it in Premiere Pro, I might export it into Photoshop to tweak it and put it back. So yeah.
Chris, just to sort of follow up on the chat here, brilliant talk. Would love to see some more practical demonstrations if possible next time. So next time is cropping up again. Thank you for a great and very informative session. Right, where are we going here? Yeah, thanks for said that one. More drone content from the BMFA, please. Really enjoyed listening in tonight. Yeah, come next week, there'll be some more.
And of course, feel free to submit drone content for the magazine. All the articles come from the members. We don't have a team of writers producing them. So we'd love more.
Absolutely. This has been excellent. Thank you so much for organising the event. Spot on. Affinity Photo has a great tilt mode. Thank you for the informative talk. Defo Chris needs to come back and do some more talks. So Chris, looks like you're booked. So we'll better get you sorted out for you know, a month or two's time or a couple of months' time.
I like the idea that Paul Kenyon's just put up a drone photo comp in the magazine. We could certainly do it on our Facebook page and you know, via other mediums, but potentially in the magazine as well. Yeah, Chris appears to have accidentally muted himself.
He's muted himself. It's okay. You've muted yourself, Chris. Well, there we go.
Yeah, Brad Cronk says to ease up on the convicts, please. Apparently, they're not all drunk. Yes, indeed. Yeah, if you're not signed up for the BMFA, get onto the BMFA website and join up. Oh, I've got Chris on the phone here. Hang on. You're on speaker, Chris.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with my computer. It seems to have crashed me out again. I don't know if you can unmute me your end.
Well, maybe it's just worth saying, you know, good evening to everybody, and we'll probably call it a day there. That's a fantastic end, and look, it's just a brilliant talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed my photography. I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure everybody else has. And yeah, we're going to get you back again.
It's already on YouTube, Brad. Robert Hutchins asking about non-UK resident. It's got to be UK residents, I'm afraid, for the insurance aspects.
Right.
Something to add, because it came up. A couple of things I'm doing is I'm starting to write regular articles for the BMFA News now, so they'll start coming out. And also, just to let people know, in terms of the achievement scheme, we've just written the drone or the camera drone test. So there will be an ASA and a BPC coming out for people flying Mavics and Phantoms.
Fantastic. That is excellent to see, and yeah, we shall look forward to that. And well done on your helicopter talk. Yeah, that was really very good as well. So yeah, Andy, I think we'll stop the recording and call it an evening there, if that's all right.
I think